I'm a product of the 90s. I'm a big time Conan O'Brien fan, and I think that he is one of the underrated interviewers out there. I mean, the plethora of guests that he has on that show, actors, comedians, politicians, musicians. He's very funny and self-deprecating. He also has a lot of depth, and he's not afraid to get serious and dig deep on some topics. Welcome to the Pod Circle podcast, where we bring practical tips and insights for every podcaster.
From aspiring podcasters to experts with hundreds of episodes under your belt and everywhere in between, these conversations dive into all the topics that matter most to you. All right, so last week we talked all about choosing the right format for you and your audience. If you haven't listened to that one, make sure you go back and catch up, and that'll give you a framework for what we're talking about. But today we are diving into kind of those 4 larger bucket contents that we outlined last week. And we're going to give you a few of our favorites. And what you'll notice is that the formats may be similar. I mean, we're going to talk to you about a couple different interview shows. But the way that each show is geared towards its host strengths and the wildly different needs of their audience is going to create diversity. It allows you to be creative within a format that exists. And so gives you some rules, but a box to play in. And something that you'll notice is that some of our favorite podcasts do dip in and utilize different formats. As we said from last episode, you could have an interview section and a call-in section as long as you're consistent. And so we're going to kind of dive into this. So the interview format. Tell us about that, Kyle.
Yeah, so the interview format works really well for people who just kick into another gear when they get in a room with somebody else, set up some mics, or if they're on a Riverside call just like this, and they just light up and have a really great conversation, and they're energized by that format. So if that's you, I would really pay attention to this one right here.
Yeah, so a few of my favorite interviewers just to listen to are Brené Brown, Dax Shepard, and Oprah. They're just people who are really intentional, and I think they thread the needle between talking about their own experience and having self-disclosure and being really curious about the person that they're interviewing. If you want to go and see a masterclass in interviewing, I think you should go back and listen to Brené Brown's episode with President Barack Obama. She came in so prepared for that interview, and she utilized every second that she had with that man. So I loved it. But there are a couple of other podcasters who I love that are kind of an interview format. I think we see this a lot. This is a pretty basic format for podcasts, but these ones go beyond your typical interview style. So I've really been hot, and I sent a really massive text message to Kyle about this last week on the podcast, Your Mama's Kitchen. It is an NPR journalist, and she just starts with these celebrities and well-known people and says, "Tell me about your mama's kitchen." And it really dives into a beautiful conversation about things that normally these people wouldn't talk about. Most people wouldn't think that you would bring on Matthew Broderick to talk about his mama's kitchen. You would talk about his films and his Broadway experience and the projects he's working on. But instead, he got into this really beautiful conversation about the diversity of his home and growing up with parents who were artists. And it's a really great podcast, and the way that she explores and gets tapped into a different part of people is really cool. I also really love the podcast Wiser Than Me with Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And she, for this limited series, only interviewed women who were over 70. See, Wiser Than Me. And so she just had really cool conversation with women that she admired and inspired. And I really love that. So the last that I'll talk about is a podcast called Other People's Problems. And it is with a therapist. I think it's with Esther Perel. And she doesn't really even interview. She just has you be a fly on the wall in a therapy session. So I don't know if this technically falls in an interview, but it's talking to people about their problems, which is great.
Yeah, I've listened to a few episodes of that podcast, and it's fascinating. One that I'm going to throw in here is one of my all-time favorite podcasts that we've talked about before on here is Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. I'm a product of the 90s. I'm a big time Conan O'Brien fan, and I think that he is one of the underrated interviewers out there. I mean, the plethora of guests that he has on that show, actors, comedians, politicians, musicians, you name it. And he's very funny and self-deprecating, but he also has a lot of depth, and he's not afraid to get serious and dig deep on some topics. There's several podcasters I have in mind that are really good at just posing a really great question and then just shutting up and getting out of the way and letting the guests speak, which I think is, I'm sure there's a masterclass in how to do that somewhere.
If you love Conan O'Brien, you should listen to his episode on Your Mama's Kitchen.
No, really? I didn't know he was on there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I'll definitely do that.
Okay, so the next format we're going to talk about is host-centric or a teaching format. This is for those people who can make complicated ideas simple. It's a really topic-driven conversation. and you're really shining when you're one-on-one or alone or, that kind of stuff. So here are a couple of my favorites. I just really love how these examples are going to vary a ton. One is a podcast called Very Presidential. It's this girl who's talking about the scandalous sides of different presidents. And she has a crime podcast. Her name's Ashley Flowers. She has a true crime podcast, but just kind of leaned into this space randomly and does exposés on those. I'm a parent, so Good Inside with Dr. Becky is really great. She's teaching, and then she does sometimes mix in some interviews and different episodes with interviews, but she's really great. And then you have a couple clients, Kyle, who I think do this really well and have some solo episodes that they do really well. So I want to shout out The Fiscal Feminist and Unscripted Pivots.
I'll also shout out Alex Judd with Path for Growth. They all do this very, very well.
And that's what we do. We are a host-centric or teaching format podcast.
It's true. We get on here and we run our mouths about the things that we feel like we know a thing or two about. So the next one is an audience contribution or a call-in show. So this format is for those of you who have an active and engaged audience. So the aforementioned Conan O'Brien, he has, it's the same podcast, but he also has a portion of it called Conan O'Brien Needs a Fan, where he'll have a fan call in and he talks to them and engages with them. And it's usually very, very funny. And it's a very cool way that he gets to interact with his fans and his fans with him. And everyone else gets to see this whole interaction go on. They usually find someone who is very interesting and Conan just grills them with questions and it usually goes off the rails pretty quickly. But
super fun.
Pretty fun. And I like that they, thought that was a very smart kind of spin on Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend to have Conan O'Brien Needs a Fan.
That's awesome. My example is actually a prime example to something we talked about a few weeks ago of converting a social media follower to a podcast listener. So the podcast that I want to shout out is called Petty Crimes. And I have followed this girl, a comedian, on Instagram for a while. And she just had funny reels. And I followed her for a long time. Her name was Kira. And she just randomly one time talked about her podcast. And I found it when I was bored one day. And so now I'm a listener of Petty Crimes. And they have listeners call in and tell them the petty crimes that people commit. And then they rate them and kind of act as the judge and jury. So one of the examples is I know they're really funny. It was a bachelorette party and there were some infighting between the girls and someone stole a room and some person didn't show up. And so they were who's guilty in this situation? And it was really funny. So
love that.
That's one I love. If you love New Girl, Jake Johnson just had a new podcast called We're Here to Help with him and another comedian where they have people call in and give them their problems. And then they offer what he's going to say, the advice you would get from your drunk uncle at the bar. And it's not always good advice. It's just the advice you're given.
I like that a lot. Another podcast that I listen to is called Penpals with Rory, Daniel and Rory. They're both comedians. Similar, they have a call-in show and it's just a life advice. Hey, I encountered this thing with my mother-in-law or I'm going through this thing with my girlfriend. Here's the situation. Can you help me figure it out and shed some light? And it's a very good-natured kind of thing. And so they break down all sorts of stuff. I think it's really interesting. Maybe your whole show isn't that. So even if you go on Instagram and say, hey, we're taking questions on this topic. And then you have a segment of your show where you're just responding to those questions. I even love that, the audience contribution thing as just a segment of your show. Maybe it's not every episode, but I just think it's really cool to get your listeners and your social media followers engaged in what you're talking about. And we're actually about to implement that for Mackenzie and I for one of our clients.
Yeah, totally. All right. The last one is a journalistic or investigative format. I love this format. The people who do it best, I would say, is NPR. So if you think of an NPR podcast, that's probably what this is. And I really aspire someday, if I have my druthers, to do this with my life. It takes time, it takes effort, planning, and strategy. So if this is your gym, it takes a lot of work and you're probably operating in a season format or a serial format. So a few of my favorites are Dolly Parton's America, if you've heard that. It is a beautiful podcast where this guy who is connected to Dolly Parton, I believe his dad was her doctor at Vanderbilt, and he just kind of got to know her. And he goes and does an expose on her life. And it is just really incredible journalism and a really fascinating listen. You don't even have to love Dolly Parton. I know you will love Dolly Parton after you listen to this. This American Life, Invisibilia, The Daily from the New York Times. These are some examples of prime, done well expertise.
Those are all really well produced. When I hear those types of podcasts or you describe them, I just think there's a lot of production. There's a lot of planning. There's a lot of, obviously, like you said, journalism, a lot of field interviews, and all of these things have to be storyboarded and come together. And then there's music interwoven. So I look at that and I think that's a lot of production. And there's a lot that takes to make a podcast like that sound beautiful or whatever its intended purpose is. Or if it's, if it's in the true crime, like scary or suspenseful. So
you're definitely not a solopreneur if you're doing that.
Definitely not. Like there are large teams of people behind that. So they're like TV shows for your ears.
Yes.
They're incredible. It's incredible how they produce them. Okay. So just recapping those 4 in closing here, the interview format, number 1, and number 2 is the host-centric / teaching format. Number 3 is the audience contribution or call-in show. And the last one was a journalistic or investigative format. So those are the 4 buckets that most podcast formats tend to fall into. And I would say whichever one lights you up the most and also, kind of appeals to your goals, your stated goals and your mission for your podcast and what's most palatable for your audience. That's probably the one to go for. So the ones that for our clients are typically interview format and host-centric / teaching. So those first 2 formats are very, very popular in the business space. And then a lot of times, your call-in shows will be more entertainment and as well as the last one, the journalistic and investigative format. Am I saying that right? Investigative? I feel like I fancy it up when I say investigative.
It's because you live in the UK right now. You're just getting fancy.
I'm not even going to try my British accent right now because it is not good.
Before you move, you will have to give it to us. Your best British accent. So get practicing.
Oh, absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. All righty, folks. So we're going to wrap this one up. Just a quick plug for the podcast starter kit that we offer to you guys. It's a free resource. You can find it at podcircle.com/start. That is if you are curious about podcasting, thinking about starting a podcast. Maybe you already have a podcast and you're still in the inception and you're kind of just trying to figure it all out a little bit. There's, I don't know, 6 or 7 different PDFs in there that are going to point you in the right direction. I even think if you're an established podcaster, there's a few resources in there like our content calendar and then our Riverside guest email template that you can send to guests so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to invite a guest to join your podcast via Riverside. There's just a whole lot in there. Go check it out. It's free. Again, it's at podcircle.com/start. Last thing is our strategy sessions that Mackenzie and I host. These are 1 or 2 hour sessions that we really just help podcasters, kind of 2 types, that are just getting started and they want to get started on the right foot. And they're trying to answer a lot of these questions, like how long should my show be? What kind of show format? Who is my ideal listener? How do I get in front of them? Where, like all of those kind of questions are the kind of questions that we dive into in those strategy sessions so that you can go into your podcast with a lot of clarity and honestly just start strong, knowing what your goal for the whole thing is. And that goal is going to inform every part of the production of your podcast. So there's a link for that in the show notes for those strategy sessions. It'll take you to a Calendly page. If you want to, you can sign up for a free 20-minute consultation with me, and we can see if one of those sessions might be a good fit for you and your podcast. So that's all for me. Do you have anything else, Mackenzie?
That's all. We'll see you next week, friends.